It's interesting that this concept of food sovereignty has not been the product of scholars in universities or policy think tanks like the one I work for. It's fascinating that the conceptual initiatives for the food sovereignty paradigm, and I think we can talk about a paradigm, and that'll become clear later, have largely originated through the analysis and proposals of small farmers, indigenous people, pastoralists, working outside of the establishment and coming up with their own citizen-based view of the future. And for them, it's important to state that food sovereignty is a high priority because small-scale producers everywhere are increasingly pushed off their land by the combined effects of two modern forms of enclosure. On the one hand, you have an expanding network of protected areas and market-based conservation schemes. And on the other hand, people are moved off the land through the spread of industrial monocultures and livestock farming. And the environment and people are suffering in both cases. If anyone wants evidence for this, you just have to look at the latest Millennium Ecosystem Assessment to look at the environmental impacts of modern food systems and agriculture. So we're talking about two forms of enclosure and finding a response to that, thinking outside the box. And I just want to reiterate again on some of the main dimensions of the food sovereignty paradigm, which is first and foremost the right of peoples to define their own food, agriculture and land use policies, acknowledging that there is currently a democratic deficit in how those decisions are taken, and reclaiming the right to define their own food, agriculture and land use policies. It's also about gender-inclusive and equitable access and control over land, water, seeds, animal breeds, and territories. And finally, next it's about promoting ecologically sound and sustainable production models, mainly based on agroecological principles and artisanal fisheries, all based and anchored in high levels of biocultural diversity. And finally, and not least, it's about protecting domestic markets and agricultural production and regulating trade and economic exchange. These are four important pillars of the food sovereignty paradigm. Now, we're not going to be able to talk about all of this in this session. And what we've proposed to do is look more closely at this tension between the right-based approaches embedded in the food sovereignty paradigm and the current ascendancy of market-based approaches for ecosystem services, for biodiversity conservation, and for landscape management. And we've invited a panel of speakers to help us explore and tease out that particular issue, and we'll relate it back to the food sovereignty paradigm. We've had to do this because we realized that with the time available, it'd be impossible to unpack all dimensions of the food sovereignty paradigm, but we felt that that lens, looking at that polarity and contradictions between right-based approaches versus market-based approaches would be an extremely useful way of eliciting discussion and thoughts in this assembly.